Ironically, I think Al Gore's movie.
Dr. Adams and to Dr. Ford for having the opportunity to be part of this process. I'm relatively new to the Office of Sustainability, but usually when I talk to friends and family, they say, so you do recycling, right? And so ultimately it's an honor to be part of this process because the Office of Sustainability has the mission of integrating sustainable practices throughout the operations of the university, research and academics, and our community at large. Part of that has a strong scientific foundation. Part of that has a strong humanities foundation. We look at it in terms of ecological concepts, economic concepts, and social concepts. And all of it is underpinned by the need to create a shared vision for where we want the future to go and what it looks like. And all of that is dependent upon the discourse that we have and the conversations that we have and how we look at having that communication with everybody throughout the community, regardless of our background, our expertise, our position in the community. And so for us, this entire series highlights the need for that conversation, understanding how we communicate with one another when we agree and when we disagree, and how we overcome those barriers as well. And so with this, we're very, very pleased to have been invited to be part of this and to be part of this overall process of 9 months, 6 speakers that will look at how we communicate with one another and can we have a civil society and discourse in the future. So with that, thank you all very much for your attention. I think this evening is going to kick off that entire conversation well and have strong ties to sustainability as well as to all of your disciplines and backgrounds. And with that, please I'd like to thank Dr. Adams again for giving us this opportunity.
So I apologize. As I said, my name is Sean Adams. For those of you that are familiar with our speaker series, you're probably used to seeing Bonnie Efros up here introducing the speaker. I am acting director for the year while Dr. Efros is up at Princeton on fellowship. And so she has put together this excellent program, and I'd like to welcome you here in this, our inaugural talk in a series entitled Civil Society on the Future Prospects of Meaningful Dialogue. And the first 3 of these talks, including tonight's, will deal with social fragmentation to some degree and the breakdown of dialogue, and then the final 3 will deal with how we open new spaces for dialogue. So if you'll please look, you have posters in front of you when you're on campus. As a reminder, look at the posters around campus. Please visit our website, sign up to be on our email list, and you can hear more about this series and future speakers. So in my capacity as acting director, I'd also like to thank our generous co-sponsors tonight, who include the UF Libraries, the Honors Program, the Department of History, the Department of English, the Sam Proctor Oral History Program, and of course, special thanks to Matt Williams and the Office of Sustainability. The Center makes its best effort to create a collaborative space in the UF community for meaningful work on the humanities and other disciplines, and this mission would be impossible without the generosity of our sponsors. I'd like to also take this moment to thank the Associate Director of the Center, Dr. Sophia Packard, and our Assistant Sarah Harms for the work in making this possible, Phoebe Wilson, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, who helped with publicity. We always like to give a shout out to those who cut the checks, so thank you to the Office of Shared Services at the college as well. Now we'd like you to join in this discussion by reserving your questions for the Q&A portion of tonight's session. But if you'd like to join us on Twitter, I believe the hashtag is up here. We ask that you use the hashtag UF Civil Society. Okay, so our speaker tonight should offer an excellent start to the series. Dan Kahan is the Elizabeth K. Dollard Professor of Law and Professor of Psychology at Yale Law School. He's the author of a long list of scholarly publications, which encompass books, book chapters, as well as articles in journals ranging from Nature to the Harvard Law Review.
Blog entries.
Professor Kahan is a member of the Cultural Cognition Project, an interdisciplinary group of scholars that examines the ways in which the worldviews of individuals influence the ways in which they perceive the potential risks and benefits of seemingly objective scientific issues like climate change, nanotechnology, and vaccination. And this research dealing with the science communication problem does not merely highlight bias caused by partisan affiliation or incomplete information, but instead seeks to understand how our worldviews actually shape our genuine understanding of these complex and controversial issues. Professor Kahan and his colleagues at the Cultural Cognition Project have published an impressive array of scholarly articles, but also produced work along more popular lines. The project's blog, for example, offers a fascinating look at the real-time application of the research on a host of current events, and uses lively and vivid prose to do so. I plan to use a term that I came across in a recent post, the tapeworms of cognitive illiberalism, in discussion whenever the opportunity arises. But whether we're aimed at broad or scholarly audiences, Professor Kahan's research agenda sheds light on how thoughtful can be worlds apart on significant scientific questions, and perhaps more importantly, what we might do to find solutions, if not consensus, on some of the most pressing problems facing us today. And so for those reasons, I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Kahan.
Well, thank you very much, Sean. But well, if I'm launching this project to see if we can understand how to improve dialogue and end factionalization, I guess neither of us should call people tapeworms of cognitive illiberalism. And that probably won't work. And I'm told, too, since this is the inaugural in this series, that people won't have yet learned about how to be civil. People are going to heckle and so forth. That's okay. I'll be expecting that. But I want to thank the Office of Sustainability and the Center for inviting me here. It's very gratifying for me to be able to share my ideas with people, but it's also just tremendously kind of meaningful to me to be able to be at a university where I can see kind of palpable evidence that something that in fact is very distressing to me is being addressed in a concerted, passionate, intelligent way by other people. There's a real disconnect between what we know about how the world works and the way in which the knowledge we have can be used to improve people's lives on the one hand, and our understanding of how to assure that that knowledge actually makes its way in a form that's recognizable and usable by the people whose lives it can actually help. And that kind of deficit has really gotten us into trouble. And it won't fix itself. It'll only be fixed through a concerted effort of people who want to integrate our best understandings of how people come to know what they know with the practice of science-informed policymaking. And it's not clear how to do that, how to have that kind of integration. So what you need are lots of people who understand what that need is about to kind of model it and do it, right, in universities, creating programs where you'll have the kinds of interconnections between the sorts of disciplines that would start to create that kind of integration. And the University of Florida's a model of that. I mean, I saw it all, lots of it today, and it was very, very gratifying and inspiring. And so I just want to thank you for giving me the chance to see something like that. Now, what am I going to talk about here? Actually, it's related to what I just said. I mean, I want to talk about the science, really, of science communication. And you know, you could understand the science of communication as, I guess, is the application of the kind of signature methods of observation and disciplined inference associated with science to the process by which people come to know what's known by science or something like this. But I actually think that the more kind of useful way to define it is as a kind of a remedy for two fallacies, right? Now, fallacies have to be in Latin, right? So like, one of them is res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself, right? So in other words, there's not any need for a science of science communication. It just, valid science just communicates itself. Right? People will just recognize that. I don't know why anybody ever took that seriously, right? But now the evidence is all around us that in the face of compelling science on all manner of issue, we're not able to understand or recognize what it is. We disagree about it. It doesn't communicate itself. Now, the second fallacy, ab uno dice omnes, from one learn to know all. Right? You get over the idea that you don't need to have a science of science communication. The next mistake you could make is to think, well, the science of science communication is kind of one thing only, unitary. That the same kinds of insights I would use to effectively communicate information about a medical procedure, say, if I'm a doctor, to somebody who's trying to consider to have surgery, is the same kind of communication skill that I'm going to need if I'm a science journalist and I'm trying to make the Higgs boson clear to people, or the same kinds of science communication skills that somebody needs if they're trying to advise a policymaker on how the projections of different sea level rise models work, right? Oh, and that's, of course, the same thing that would get us out of the problem with climate change and all that. These are all science communication problems, right? But they all involve different kinds of mechanisms. And they all admit of empirical observation and the study that would be geared to helping us improve our proficiency in these kinds of things. But then you have to separate them out. And so what I'm going to do is talk about the form of the science of science communication that probably you'd be least likely to think of. Let me say science of science communication as an instrument for protecting the science communication environment, right? And the claim is that just as the health of individuals depends on the quality of a natural environment, the health of a democratic society depends on the quality of a science communication environment, right? And that in the same way that the natural environment is a public good that has to be attended to through collective action, and no single individual's behavior will be sufficient to protect it, you have to have collective action to protect the science communication environment too. If you don't, you'll have a sick democracy. Right? Now, I'm not, that's kind of abstract. And I'm done being abstract. I'm not even going to try to fill in any more of the argument. What I'm just going to do instead is kind of walk you through 4 points here. 3 of them will be actually points about studies. I'll go through these studies, and then I'll tell you something about the study that's going to be a kind of a building block for this argument that I'm hoping is going to get you to the point where you see what I'm getting at with the idea that we need to think of the science communication environment as something that needs protection, and that one of the functions of the science of science communication is to guide that, right? So the first thing I talk about is the HPV vaccine, and probably you know about the HPV vaccine, that the human papillomavirus is an extremely prevalent sexually transmitted disease. I think 45% of well, women, probably men too, although there's not a test for men, in their 20s or 30s have been exposed to the virus. It's the only cause, actually, of cervical cancer. And in 2006, the FDA approved a vaccination for HPV. And the CDC recommended that there be universal vaccination of adolescent girls as they're about to go into middle school. It's very important that you immunize someone before they could be involved in sexual activity, because once you've been exposed to the virus, then you obviously can't get the benefit of the vaccine. And legislation was proposed almost in every state to have the HPV vaccine added to the schedule of the childhood vaccinations that are a condition of entering middle school. And there was tremendous political opposition to this. It defeated in every single state but one, Virginia, because Virginia is very, very kind kind of useful. It has a good environment for manufacturing HPV. Merck the manufacturer found out, and it gave them a lot of money to open up a plant there. Right? Actually, DC too. Now, so we did this study, how to try to understand something like this, and it was a large, nationally representative sample of individuals, and we asked them about their perceptions of the risks and benefits of the HPV vaccine. I informed a scale that could help us to measure that. Another thing, we then tested their responses in 3 experimental conditions. Right? In the first one, there were no arguments. We just said, what do you think about the HPV vaccine? You ask a bunch of questions about it. Now, we had also measured what we call the cultural outlooks. Right? We use a scale. I'll tell you more about this. But essentially, we're assessing people's preferences about how society should be organized along these 2 dimensions, individualism and communitarianism, hierarchy and egalitarianism. And what we found, you can kind of identify people as belonging to groups formed by the combinations of these kinds of outlooks, is that even these people we didn't give any information to, this is like 2008, very early on in the controversy, they were a bit divided on this. Right? The group up here, the hierarchical individualists, that thought that the risks outweighed the benefits, and the egalitarian communitarians that the benefits would outweigh the risk. But it wasn't that big an effect. The next thing we did was give another group of subjects some balanced arguments. Right? So you show them it's actually valid evidence about what the vaccine will accomplish. Right? It'll protect you, but only from 70% of the strains of HPV and so forth. Balanced arguments. And the groups, their counterparts of the subjects who were a little bit divided in the no argument, right, no information condition, they became even more polarized. Right? So we're just giving them the information, kind of thing they might get at the doctor's office, but they're actually then reading it in ways that reinforce what we already saw was a predisposition to disagree about the risks and the benefits of the vaccine. Now, the next thing we did was we take another group of subjects, and we show them the same arguments, but now attributed to experts. These are culturally identifiable experts. We created these in a pretest. Right? So we basically, you said to people, oh, it's a kind of a blink test. Can you just tell by looking what somebody's values are? What do you think this person would say about X, Y, and Z? And then we're able to identify, right, the basic perception somebody would have of what kind of person is this, right? And now in our study, well, we're identifying these as public health experts, and we're assigning the arguments that I described to them, or the information, I shouldn't even call them arguments. And we find that now the positions that the subjects form on the perception of HPV risk depends very heavily on the relationship of their own cultural outlooks, which we measured, and the cultural outlooks of the 2 advocates who are giving them the information. Right? So if you're getting the position that we would say is associated with your cultural predisposition based on what we observed in the other conditions, from the advocate who we would anticipate you're going to identify as somebody having your values, right? And you're observing the argument that you're predisposed to reject coming from somebody who probably you think looks like Fidel Castro as a young man or something like this, well, that amplifies the effect even more. Right? So you get even more polarization. But if you turn things around, right? So now you're getting the position that we would think you're predisposed to reject, and it's coming from somebody who looks like somebody you probably would identify with, and the argument you're predisposed to accept, but now it's coming from somebody you're not going to think is like you, and it kind of turns around, right, completely. And we also were able to create a condition in which is a pluralistic argument environment. People are getting information from advocates or experts whose values are equally proximate or remote from theirs, and there's a lot less polarization, at least, than there is in the condition where you see what we would call this kind of expected alignment. Right? Now, that's the study. I want to use that to kind of introduce some important concepts. I'm going to talk about the science communication problem and the cultural cognition thesis. Right? Now, the science communication problem, that to me, I'm just referring here to the failure of widely available, compelling science to quiet public controversy about risks or other kinds of facts to which that scientific evidence speaks in a very authoritative way. I mean, the climate change is the most kind of salient example, but it's not the only one, right? In fact, the kind of research that I do started in the 1970s when what the social scientists are trying to understand is how come there's this divide between the experts and this consensus on the safety of nuclear power and the public, right? And there's the HPV vaccine, right? But or it's this kind of I guess irony, we know so much. No one's ever known as much as us, but we can't agree about what it is we know, right? When Justinian said that the sodomy causes earthquakes, he's wrong, but everybody at least agreed, got the memo. And how do we explain something like this? And well, one explanation of the cultural cognition thesis, the idea is that people will conform their perceptions of risks and other kinds of policy relevant facts to the kinds of groups that share their values and that are important in their everyday lives. They're trying to figure out how the world works, but also to make their way in the world, important affinity groups, right? And this cultural cognition thesis then kind of requires three things. One is specifying what these groups are. Another is to specify what the mechanisms might be that connect the group affiliations with these perceptions. And then you also need evidence, and I gave you some evidence of something like that here, right? But evidence, too, that it's this phenomenon as opposed to other plausible possibilities that are accounting for the science communication problem. Because you see, there are lots of things that could possibly be causing it. With any interesting phenomenon, there are more plausible explanations than can actually be true. And so the only way to figure out which from the sea of the plausible is the actual best explanation is to do empirical testing. Otherwise, you just sort of drown in a sort of sea of storytelling. But you have to pit plausible hypotheses against each other. So I'm going to do that with the cultural cognition thesis, too. But here, going back to this first question, what are the groups? I mean, we use this framework. We are adapting it from a work of an anthropologist, Mary Douglas, and a political scientist, Aaron Wildavsky. They had a position they called the cultural theory of risk. And it was exactly this idea that people would form perceptions of risk that reflected and reinforced their commitment to ways of life or groups who shared ways of life that could be characterized by a scheme like this. Right? So their position was that people who had these hierarchical and individualistic values, that they would be pretty skeptical about claims of environmental risk. Right? Why exactly? They didn't have good mechanisms. But the idea is that if people in society start to accept that markets, industry, business, commerce is dangerous, that will justify restricting it. And businesses, market, commerce, that's very important in the way of life of people who have the hierarchical and individualistic values, not just materially, but also kind of symbolically and emotionally. That these kinds of activities represent excellence in their eyes, and so they push back on it. Now, the egalitarian communitarians, they're already kind of morally suspicious of commerce and industry. They see it as a source of unjustified social disparities. So it's congenial to them to accept the idea these are very dangerous things and they should be restricted. And they were actually, Wildavsky and Douglas, making this claim to try to explain opposition to nuclear power and so forth. right? And we've done other kinds of things, guns, gun control. Here's an idea, just another disputed issue. Right? I mean, guns have a kind of cultural significance. That they're almost pieces of equipment that allow someone to inhabit a kind of cultural role, father or protector, provider. That they signify certain kinds of individualistic virtues like courage and honor. And they do that especially for men, for white men who have these values that are hierarchical, more traditional and individualistic. So the claim would be that they're going to have a special stake in people not seeing that activity of owning a gun as being harmful. Right? Maybe want to restrict it, or maybe see somebody who does it as a source of harm to others. So they form the perception that guns are safe. Right? And in fact, what's dangerous is to restrict guns, because then you make people prone to predation. And the egalitarian communitarians have a kind of aversion to guns. They associate them with patriarchy, or with the enforcement of apartheid, essentially, in the South, or see them as symbols of a kind of a distrust of other people, as everybody for him or for himself or him or herself, right? And so they're more inclined to see the guns as risky and the gun control as being effective, and lots of other kinds of issues, including ones that would divide people along this other axis: hierarchy, communitarianism, and egalitarian individualism, right? Now, you can collect lots of observational data, survey data. You measure people's outlooks using attitudinal scales, right? See whether they'll agree with statements that you would think would indicate this kind of outlook. And then you can correlate them with people's perceptions of risk. And now we already know that people tend to, to form packages of risk perceptions. You're not surprised when the person who tells you that he thinks that the Earth is not getting warmer also believes that it does help to reduce crime to carry the gun, and they're not causally connected. But once he tells you that, then you probably have some idea about lots of things in that person's life, right? Well, we want to be able to measure that, but we want to be able to figure out what the mechanisms are. Right? What explains why it is that people who would have these kinds of outlooks would form these particular kinds of risk perceptions? And actually, two of them were featured in the study I showed you about the HPV vaccine. And I call one the identity protective cognition. It's a lot easier for people to believe that the activities that they view as virtuous are safe or beneficial, and the ones that they view as base are dangerous, than vice versa. It's also potentially socially very costly to form positions on those matters that are different from other people who are important in your life. And so people are going to have a tendency to want to conform their view to the one that people who share their values have, as a way to protect the status of their group and their standing within it, right? But of course, people know that they aren't experts. By the way, we saw a little bit of that in the study I showed you with the HPV vaccine, where people were just looking at the information, right, and forming these divergent views. We've done other studies, including one on nanotechnology, that work like that. But people know, that they're not experts on these issues, on how whether the Earth's heating up or whether more guns will be more crime or less. So they're going to find out what the experts think, right? But the experts that they tend to view as knowing something about how the world works, the ones that they trust as having a kind of credible understanding of these things, are the ones who tend to have values like theirs. And if those experts or authorities that they're seeking this kind of guidance from are themselves divided, maybe because of identity protective cognition or any other kind of thing, then that's going to kind of amplify the polarization. Right? So that was what was going on also in the HPV vaccine experiment. And there are other mechanisms too. You know about the availability effect, that people tend to they tend to overestimate the frequency of certain kinds of events based on how readily they can recall them or how vivid they are in their minds. Right? Well, the theory here is that how likely you are to take note of something that's relevant to risks, right? And to assign it significance and to recall it is going to depend on your cultural outlook, that you are more likely to take notice, to assign significance, and recall the incident when it's consistent with your cultural outlook than when it isn't. And we've done studies like that too, showing that something like this happens when people are trying to figure out, well, what's scientific consensus? Scientific consensus on issues like climate change or gun control or nuclear power. And it isn't the case that members of these groups, any of them, are saying, screw what the scientists think. They all believe that the position that's predominant in their group is consistent with scientific consensus. Well, we did an experiment where we showed people, scientists, ones who had elite credentials, and in the fields that would be relevant to assessing whether nuclear power is safe or whether climate change is happening or whether gun control will increase crime or reduce it. And we said, are these people experts? And people would see them as experts if they took the position that was the same one that predominated in their group. Otherwise, they would say, well, he's not an expert on that, you see. And if, you know, they're not going to go to the North Pole and stick a thermometer in it to figure out whether climate change is happening. They're also not out there doing surveys. It's probably hard to do anyway, of what scientific consensus is on these issues. They're being exposed to information, but there's a kind of biased sampling on this. If this is what they're doing, they're crediting the evidence of scientific opinion when it's consistent with the position that's dominant in their group, but otherwise not. Well, then they're going to polarize on what scientific consensus is on these issues, right? Because they'll be more able to recall experts saying what's consistent with their group's position. And we have evidence of that too. Now, these are mechanisms to try to explain this kind of effect. But we want to test the hypothesis, right, the cultural cognition thesis, that that's what's driving the science communication problem, right, explaining this kind of puzzling disparity between how much we know and how little we agree about what we know against other possible explanations. Right? I call one the public irrationality thesis. Right? And the idea is people are divided on issues like climate change because they're not very science literate and they misunderstand what scientists say, or maybe they're easily misled about what the scientific evidence is. They also don't think the way that scientists do. Right? Scientists tend to think in a deliberate, kind of systematic, dispassionate way, drawing inferences from evidence, what Kahneman called a slow system to. The members of the public, they think in the fast, emotional, heuristic-driven way, and the image of the fuselage on fire sticking out of a skyscraper with people jumping out, that's going to make a bigger impression on you than the polar bear floating away on the ice. So you'll overestimate the actuarial magnitude of that more compelling, emotionally gripping risk than one that might actually be even more significant, but that's more remote. When you see it, you're nodding because it makes sense. And this is a very recognizable theory. And it's based on real mechanisms in social science. But you see, if you just kind of help yourself to the grab bag of mechanisms, because there's a lot of them in decision science, you can make just about anything sound plausible. Right? And you can be David Brooks or somebody else. I mean, it sounds like you really know. You've got to test these things. So we do a study, and this is the study on the climate change, on the relationship. Well, we want to collect evidence that will help us to assess these two hypotheses. What we do is we ask a lot of people, we get another large nationally diverse sample. How serious do you think the risk of climate change is, like on a scale of like 0 to 10? I mean, we all know the answer to that. It's 8.3 or something like that. There really isn't an answer to a question like that. The average was 5.7. Is that too low? I know this, that anything I ask people about climate change, is the temperature of the Earth heating up? Right? Is that because human beings are burning fossil fuels? Is that making the ice melt on the North Pole? That's going to correlate about 0.9 with the response that they give to this question. Right? They have a kind of generic global attitude. And this is therefore a very kind of efficient way to get a sense of what their orientation is. And what you use it for is to assess sources of variance. Right? I look for patterns in the who sees, who's picking a higher number, who's picking a lower number. And if you do that, you can test hypotheses about why it is that there's public dissensus in the face of scientific consensus on climate change. Right? So if you believe that now kind of centered the median member of society, or the average person in our sample who said 5.7 at 0 just for convenience. But if you accept the public irrationality thesis, then you'll have a prediction. If the reason that this person here doesn't take climate change as seriously as he or she should relative to what the scientists say because the person doesn't know enough science or doesn't think the way that a scientist does, right? Well, then you would expect as people become more science literate, as they become more proficient in engaging in the kind of slow, systematic, system 2 reasoning that you need to make sense of evidence, they would become more concerned about climate change. Right? So we test that hypothesis because we measure their science literacy using tests from the National Science Foundation. It shows that Afghanistan just passed us, but we're still doing all right. Right? We also numeracy, which is a measure not just of how good you are at math, but your proficiency in being able to draw inferences from quantitative information. It's a good measure of whether you're disposed to use the slow system 2 thinking as opposed to the fast heuristic system 1, right? And we find that, in fact, people don't become more concerned as they become more science literate and more numerate. They seem to become less concerned. Now, this is actually a really small effect, and it's a pretty big sample. I mean, if it had been tilted slightly upward, to me it would have the same significance. The point is it's not the strong effect upward that you would expect if you started with the public rationality thesis. I mean, it's evidence that's less consistent with that theory than with the conclusion that something else is going on. Right? So what else could be going on? We can combine, actually, the two measures here, the science literacy and numeracy, that they correlate pretty well. Right? They're picking up something, and they actually don't correlate nearly as well just with education. So there's always some kind of disposition that they're both measuring, a science comprehension measure. Right? Now, we also look at the cultural outlooks. There's a tremendous amount of variance that's explained by see, we win, ours is bigger than yours. But that's not really what we're doing in this study. We want to know what the relationship is between the kind of already well-established association between people's cultural identities and their perceptions of these risks. This by itself is not inconsistent with the public rationality thesis, right? Because you might think that people who know the science and who can understand it, they're going to get the evidence and they're going to go with that. People who don't know a lot of science, they can't make sense of it, well, they have to go with their gut. And it's filled with crap, like what do other people like me think, or something like that. And if that's what you believe, essentially that the cultural cognition effect is a kind of a heuristic substitute for having science comprehension, again, you'll have a prediction that the people who are more hierarchical and individualistic, who are skeptical about climate, as they become more science literate and numerate, they ought to become more concerned. And the big gap that exists between people who have these outlooks, it ought to be shrinking, right? Because they'll be relying less and less on this heuristic substitute for understanding the evidence, so they ought to be converging, right? Well, you can test that. And we find that the egalitarian communitarians have become slightly more concerned as they become more science literate. Only slightly, because you see, if they got any more concerned, they would be running around screaming. It's actually much more frightening to them than the terrorism. It's not the case that everybody is more concerned about terrorism than climate change. But the hierarchical individualists, as they become more science literate and numerate, become less concerned. Right? So the gap that's already pretty large among people who are the least science literate and numerate, it just gets bigger among people who are even more science literate and numerate. Right? polarization is increasing as science literacy and numeracy increase. Right? That's consistent with the cultural cognition thesis. Right? What's the argument? I could call this the tragedy of the science communication commons. Right? Well, here's the thing. If you see something like this, this is not evidence of irrationality. Right? It's too much rationality. People are too good at extracting from the accounts of the evidence the information that's most consequential for them in their individual lives. What you believe about climate change isn't going to affect it. Right? Nothing you do as a consumer, as a voter, as somebody who's trying to contribute to public dialogue is going to determine whether we adopt policies that affect climate change. You just don't matter enough individually. And so if you make a mistake in any of those capacities because you have the wrong view of science, it actually doesn't increase your risk or anybody else's in any measurable way. But given what the importance of having a position consistent with your group is, if you make a mistake in that respect, you could be in big trouble. And if I go back to New Haven, I'm marching around campus. I don't know, would this happen here? There's a sign that says, you know, climate change is a hoax and stuff. I have tenure, but still, it wouldn't be good, you know, for me. Now, you know who Bob Inglis is? He was a congressman in South Carolina. I think he set like all the records for most conservative ever. Perfect records from all of the ratings. You know, give everybody invasive ultrasound. How about that? You know, no, really very conservative. But then he tells his constituents in South Carolina, you know, I think climate change is happening, so I'm going to do something about it. And he's out of the office. He loses in the primary, Republican primary, in the next election, 2010, right? Now, if you're Floyd the barber in the 4th District of South Carolina, a guy comes in for a shave, you're going to say, sign my petition to save the polar bears. You think that's a good idea? You'll be out of a job as quickly as Bob Inglis was, because climate change is the kind of issue on which people now are judging whether you're a socially reliable kind of person, right? And what would a rational, well, people are good at information, they extract from it what's relevant to them. And no cost for making a mistake on the science, huge cost for being out of line with my group. I'm going to attend to information in a way that orients me toward the group's position. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to do that. But if you are pretty good at math, you know, and science, you can just do an even better job. You can argue back, and you can get books and things like that. You don't think more like a scientist as you become more science and comprehending by these measures. You just become a better, more reliable indicator of what people who have your identity think about this particular issue. But you see, that's rational for you. It's not good for society, because if everybody's doing this at once, then you're not going to converge on the best evidence that actually could be very consequential for your well-being. But that doesn't change the incentives you have, because what you believe isn't going to have that be, it won't have that consequence. It won't be bad if you make a mistake. So you see, there's a kind of a tragic misalignment between the individual rationality and a collective rationality. But that's what's happening with the cultural cognition thesis. Now, that's actually another mechanism, right? We're going to say that cultural cognition is culturally motivated system 2 reasoning. People are using the critical reasoning capacities in a way that reinforces their connection to their group, right? And we actually, that's a story now. I told you about this observational data. So we can actually test this. We did I've published one study that was an experiment on this using a measure of cognitive reflection, which is also a good measure of system 2 reasoning, and showed that when people are dealing with complicated conceptual information, people who are higher in cognitive reflection are more likely to react in a way that reflects a kind of decision to credit it. If it's consistent with their ideology, then not, right? Then people are low in it. But here's something new with numeracy. And I talked about gun control, right? Here's a study we did. We showed people, well, you know, there was an experiment that was done here. We needed to help us out Scientists did an experiment. We need you to help us to understand what the results were. People, they want to test a new skin cream. And, sometimes skin cream actually makes things worse. Okay? Sometimes things get better on their own anyway, and sometimes it works. So you really need to do a test to figure out whether it's working. You gave it to lots of people, and here's what the results were, right? So you say, well, 223 people who did use it got better, 75 who used it got worse, 107 who did not use it got better, 21 got worse. Well, what's the answer? I mean, you all see, of course, that means that people who use the skin cream were more likely to get worse. It's actually, you would see it if you spent some time. Initially, you might go, hey, like 223 got better and 107, that's more. And 223 got better versus 75, it must be working. But that's not right, you see, because you're 5 times as likely to get better if you didn't use it, and only 3 times as likely to get better if you did. Therefore, the people who used it weren't likely to get better. They were more likely to get worse. This is a complicated problem. You have to detect covariance. You need to look at the information and understand what the ratios are. And it's essential to making valid causal inferences from data. And we know people have a lot of trouble with this because they use this kind of heuristic that I described, where you compare cell A to B or to C instead of looking at the ratios, right? And of course, we had 2 versions of it, and one in which the skin rash cream was working, the other in which it wasn't. And we tested the numeracy again of our subjects, and this is a disposition that you're not only good at math, but you have a disposition and a kind of proficiency in using it in a way that enables you to use quantitative information in a correct way to draw appropriate inferences from it. And there's a good distribution here in our sample. And what you see here is that this is a scatter plot, but I've got the relationships indicated with a smoother here. That the people who are low in numeracy in the rash increases condition, they're getting it exactly wrong. In the rash decreases condition, they're getting it wrong, right? Everybody's getting exactly wrong until they get pretty numerate, about 7 right. Then you're starting to get the right answer consistently, right? That's kind of what you would expect. You have to be like pretty close to the 90th percentile before people are really reliably getting this right. Now, then we do another version of it, where the scientists want to know whether gun control reduces crime or increases crime. So they collect the data from cities that had the gun bans and the ones that didn't. And here's the information. Can you please tell us? And again, we manipulate the headings on the column so in a way that generates different results, and results that you would have to be pretty numerate to understand are the right ones in this case. And now here's what we see. Well, it's easier to see that there's something a little bit weird about the guns when they're together. I mean, it is kind of going up, but there's something else going on. Gee, I wonder if it might be the subject's ideology. So we look at the numeracy of the subjects as well. Right? And I guess the Republicans are slightly more numerate. It wasn't a big difference. And in the skin rash version of the experiment, right? Hey, conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats are measuring their dispositions with standard measures of their political outlooks and party affiliation. They're both more likely to get the right answer as they become more numerate. There's no difference, right? But now look what happens with the gun version of the experiment. Right? When crime's decreasing, the really highly numerate liberal Democrats are very likely to get the right answer. But if the right answer is crime increasing, they're not. They're not any better than the ones who are low in numeracy. And the Republicans who are highly numerate, they're more likely to get it right. They look at it and they say, wait, it looks like it's decreasing. It's not. It's increasing because you look at the ratios. But if in fact they look at it and they say, hey, it looks like it's increasing, that's the answer they pick, and they're wrong. They didn't engage with the problem, right? We model this. Yeah, but these are the distribution of essentially the regression estimate. I had like 1,000 people who had these political values, and compare people who would score 3 versus 8 on the numeracy test, and you're very unlikely to get the answer right in either condition, no matter what your ideology. In the skin treatment version, very likely to get it right no matter what your ideology is if you're high numerate Republican or liberal Democrat. Now look at the gun ban, right? Huge discrepancies. Now there are discrepancies here, but they're smaller. And that's what the point really was of this experiment was to try to test this conjecture. Are the people more divided who have this better proficiency in understanding the evidence because they're using their critical reasoning skills in this kind of opportunistic way, right? Much bigger gaps, polarization, about twice as big a gap in the likelihood of getting the answer correct for the high numeracy than the low numeracy. Because the high numeracy have been much better than the low numeracy people in seeing when it actually is consistent with their position. If they're getting information, you see, they look at it, hey, that doesn't look right, and they keep working at it. If you're not very numerate, you can't do very much with it. But if you are numerate, you can get the right answer. But if you look at it and it's got the right answer, you're done, right? Well, now, this is toxic. There's something toxic going on here. Toxic meanings and the debilitation of reason. See, this is not normal, right? That's normal. And this, I told you, is rational for individuals. But it's pathological, both in the sense of being bad because it'll be collectively very harmful to them, but also really rare. Right? The number of issues on which people who have these kinds of outlooks are polarized in this way, and on which greater science comprehension enlarges the polarization relative to the ones where they're not polarized, is huge. Not very many issues are like this. There's no dispute. I mean, there's some people who think pasteurized milk is bad, right? But that's not, maybe they'll get media coverage, but there's not a cultural conflict about that. You won't see this on that. Right? People aren't in conflict about whether the cell phones are going to give them brain cancer or whether the high transmission lines are giving people leukemia. They actually are in the UK, right? But not here. How are these members of these groups figuring it out? We should talk to the biologists. They must be better science communicators than climate scientists so they'd explain how pasteurization of milk works. No, right? People have to kind of orient themselves, accept as known by science much more than they could possibly understand on their own, right? They do that by figuring out who knows what about what. That's what they're experts at. And how do they do that? By using these kinds of mechanisms. Right? They, as socially competent people, immerse themselves in communities of other people where that information is likely to reside and figure it out. Who knows what's what about this? And all of those groups are pretty good at giving them that information. If there was a group out there that was consistently misleading its members about what was known to science and it was consequential for their lives, they wouldn't be doing that good. Right? So people are looking to different kinds of groups, but they're usually getting to the same place. Right? It's only when you have this kind of weird association of positions on the issue with identity. Right? Position on climate change means something about what kind of person you are. That then people are going to be diverging because they'll have a bigger stake in having identity congruent and truth congruent views. Those kinds of meanings and associations, they're pollution in the science communication environment. Right? They deform the capacity of people to use what in fact are what we know to be the most effective and admirable kinds of critical reasoning. Right? We have to fix that. Now, so I'm out of time. I can't tell you what to do. Can I take 5 more minutes? Okay, because you want me to fix it. You want, tell us what to do. Tell us what to do with climate change, you'll say, right? To get rid of this toxic meaning association. But I'm not going to tell you anything about that because, first of all, I know that there's no risk that you won't, ask me about it, and I have something to say, But I think though there is a risk that if I start talking about that, you won't ask the more important question, which is how did something like this happen? How do these things happen? Because it's not normal. Right? How does the science communication environment, the sum total of processes and cues and interactions that normally guide ordinary people reliably to what's known that's important in their lives, get saturated with these kinds of divisive meanings? And, I'm going to go back to the vaccines. CDC recommends the HPV vaccine, and there's this huge, they recommend the H1N1 vaccine at the same time. And there was a conflict about that. Who's going to get to the front of the line? They're kind of trampling over the old people and young ones who are supposed to be getting it. Oh, no, the experts say we need. Yeah, but well, come on, of course, this is going to be controversial. It's suffused with meanings. You're telling the people, hey, your 11, 12-year-old daughter, the one in the swing in the backyard, yeah, the one's going to have sex next year, she needs to have a shot, and don't bring her to school otherwise. You know, that's going to have a kind of emotional resonance. My point is that resonance is not, there's nothing inevitable about that. Well, I don't care about the H1N1. The other vaccine is the HPV vaccine for hepatitis B. Hepatitis B is a sexually transmitted disease, and the CDC recommended that children get it universally, and there was no controversy. In fact, states steadily added it to their schedule of mandatory vaccinations. Now almost all states have it. And in the very years, 2007 to 11, where we're fighting about the HPV vaccine, over 90% vaccination rate for the hepatitis B vaccine, right, for boys and girls, as opposed to the now anemic 33% for teenage girls on the HPV. So, you know, tell me why the HPV vaccine acquired this meaning. I'll tell you why. You know, a marketing decision by Merck that affected how the drug was introduced. You know, first, it wanted to fast-track it, which meant it had to be for girls only because only women had a serious enough disease, cervical cancer, to warrant the accelerated approval of the drug. But now it's going to be for girls, you see. And then Merck launches this high-profile campaign legislatively to have all the state legislatures consider the proposal to have the vaccine made mandatory. That's not the way vaccines get added to the list normally. In all the cases with the HPV, these are public health administrators operating outside the political realm. They read the CDC says we should do this, and they add it to the list. It's not a big deal. But it is a big deal, you see, when somebody's saying, hey, we've got a shot for your 12-year-old daughter, she can't come to school, and you know, you're going to learn about it because there's a dispute over what your legislature is going to do. And Merck didn't have to do this. If it hadn't fast-tracked the HPV vaccine for girls only, it would have been approved only 3 years later, probably even sooner, but for the controversy, you know, slowed it down, in 2009, right? If they hadn't tried to propose that all legislatures adopt these laws, it would have been universally available immediately through insurance and through government programs. And, you know, you would have seen, because it wouldn't have been a big politically contentious issue, the public health administrators adding it to the list, just like with HPV. Now, that wouldn't have been very good for Merck, you see, because they're in competition with someone else, the GlaxoSmithKline with its alternative vaccine, already improved in Europe. You got to get in there first, you know, with our vaccine and tie up the contracts with the schools before GlaxoSmithKline can get in, you know. So it wouldn't have been very good, maybe, for Merck if they had not followed the path that was most likely to invest the vaccine with these kinds of cultural meanings, right? But it would have been better for the U.S. because then people wouldn't have learned about the HPV vaccine on Fox News and MSNBC. You see, they would have learned about it from their doctor, who they picked because they obviously trust the person, letting him or her treat their child. And now he's like, hey, I'm going to jab this into Jane or Jimmy, you know, because it's approved for both boys and girls as of 2009. And, you know, you say, okay, good, hurry up, we're on our way to soccer practice or something like this. We know people trust their physicians. They do on HPV. They would have trusted them on HPV too, except that you see what happens in a study like this. They're actually going to decide whether the guy actually knows what he's talking about. He's not an expert. I need a new doctor. He just told me my daughter should get the HPV shot. That's not the way things usually work. Merck created that, right? That it marketed the drug. Well, it tried to avoid this, actually, because it's not stupid. It understands these mechanisms, too. But the problem is it's stupid. It went out there and hired Governor Perry. You know, he issues an order to make Texas the first state to have a mandatory HPV because he's very concerned about this. But, of course, he's doing that because he got huge campaign contributions from Merck. And he is governor, oops, after all, so this comes out. And when it comes out, it not only alienates all the people he was supposed to be trying to, you know, he was going to be assuring them because he's like the figure in that cell. Now these guys, too, say, oh, look, corporations, trying to screw around with democracy. Remember Vioxx? Yeah, there's consensus now. Both the egalitarian communitarians and the hierarchical individualists believe that you'll get a tumor growing in your brain if you have HPV vaccine. You know, tremendous ambivalence about this. That didn't have to happen, you see. And this is not 20/20 hindsight. 2005, people saw this happening. In 2007, doctors are saying, you know, that this is not the appropriate way to introduce this. Their arguments weren't rejected. They just weren't even entertained. There's no room in the process for considering what the science communication impact is of introducing a critical drug, a critical product of the knowledge we have about how to improve people's lives, right? No, we have a brain to figure out the science part. We don't even have a brain stem when it comes to the science communication part. You know, that's the tragedy here. You can avoid these kinds of things from happening. You know, they don't have to happen. The same kinds of methods that you can use to explain these things after the fact, you can use to try to forecast the conditions that could trigger these conditions in time to do something else or minimize the likelihood that that will happen, right? If we don't all die from climate change or from doing something stupid in response to climate change wasn't necessary, I don't know what'll kill us. Well, we don't want this happening with synthetic biology or nanotechnology. You know, this is nanotechnology. There's no cultural polarization. Huge. This bimodal distribution of climate change. Could that happen? Well, you know, you could try to forecast it. We did a study and showed that, yeah, that could happen. But where's Merck? Oh, yeah, there they are. Let's have some pollution in our science communication environment. A group out there saying, let's have the nano-free zone T-shirt contest. And this is at a point where not 80% of people don't even know what it is. But maybe you will run out of issues because they might solve climate change. So we better think ahead, right? Or you know, how about genetically modified foods? Sound tasty? You know, have a helping of pollution in your science communication environment. Because, of course, that's giving you a lot of information about the issue, right? Well, that's telling you it's, you know, whose side are you on? You do nothing about this? You do nothing about this. I told you these two fallacies. Here's another one. Nullius in verba. Take no one's word for it. This is like the motto of the Royal Society. You know, take no one's word for it. Don't take knowledge on it. Figure it out for yourself. Observe. And this is science. It's charming, but it's ridiculous, right? Because you got to accept as known much more than you possibly could figure out for yourself. How do you do it? You take the word of somebody, but somebody who knows what's known to science, and that's somebody who's a member of your community. And they usually point you in the right direction. And everybody agrees you do what the experts say, after all. But there is this problem, you see. And it's a kind of a paradox. It's built in, even. I told you before, the science communication problem is kind of, we know so much but agree so little. That's not a coincidence, right? Popper wrote The Logic of Scientific Discovery and Open Society. Because you can only have scientific knowledge, he said, in a liberal society. In a society where people can express their opinions, nobody certifies what's going to be the facts or what's orthodox. Only in that kind of society, a free society, does the progress of science and the kind of contestation and challenge that it depends on in testing have the kind of protection from interference by either mistaken or corrupt central authority. Only in that kind of society do people develop the kinds of attitudes of critical engagement. You know, nullius in verba, I'll figure it out for myself. That is required for them to actually do the testing in science. But you see, somebody then has to, in this free society that is filled with knowledge, has to help people to know what's known. And guess what? There's no official certifier anymore. Justinian, you know, it won't be listened to when he says this. Somebody's going to certify it because it's not nullius in verba. It's all these groups of certification. But there's lots of them. Of course there are, because we live in a free society, a liberal society, the society that will have the knowledge in it. It multiplies the number of pluralistic groups who form about their understandings of the best life. And they're all doing a pretty good job, you see, normally orienting their members with respect to what's known by science. But there's so many of them and so many issues, it's almost just a statistical certainty that they're going to get into these kinds of conflicts sometime, right? Well, it's a kind of paradox. Popper's revenge. You know, Tocqueville talked about the need. This is at the advent of like the democratic experience of democratic government. A new political science for a world itself quite new. You know, we need a new political science. You know, for the liberal republic of science, the one in which the very conditions that allow us to know so much, right, make it imperative for us to attend to the processes by which what's known is made known and certified, so that all of the plural groups that people depend on don't come into conflict. And you see, there's no inherent contradictions, no historical forces beyond our control, not for Popper. There are problems you solve with what? A science of science communication that tries to understand how to protect the science communication environment from becoming polluted, and also understands how to decontaminate it if that fails. But I think it's going to be a lot easier to avoid this from happening than to fix the problems. So we need, you see, a new political science. This is the science of science communication as a device to help us protect the science communication environment, because we all have a stake in it. Because when we are forced to make a choice between recognizing what's known to science and just being who we are, we will be who we are, right? And we will suffer, and our reason will be deformed. And that's not something that should happen in a society that has at its disposal the kind of power to learn how things work that science provides, right? So we need this. And you're doing this, right, here. And I get very agitated about this. But when I know that you care about this and you're working on it too, you know, then I'm filled with a lot of hope. I'm not even scared of climate change anymore, right? So that's it.
Questions?
No heckling, no.
Well, you haven't shown proclivity to hide behind the podium, so I'll do that. But any questions?
How to solve climate change, right?
So you seem like you're talking about whether people will acknowledge certain risks, but you don't seem to talk about whether people are comfortable with risk. You seem to presume that people are averse to risk.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say, first of all, I mean, it's a theory of risk perception, and so the subject matter, but it really pertains to all matter of fact that admit of investigation by decision-relevant science. Now, here's one thing. Once you know what the facts are, I mean, if we all had the best understanding available for today of what is going on with climate change, we'd still have a heck of a lot to debate about, because that doesn't uniquely determine the policy. And we might have different attitudes about what kinds of trade-offs to make. We might also have different expectations, attitudes towards risk, right? And I think one thing we could do is try to assess, you know, is there actually a kind of disposition toward risk? And how could that be entering into the, you know, that's another plausible conjecture about why you might have a science community. Do we have some people who have, it's out there, it clearly is, and it's going to be having some effect, but I think it's kind of in the interstices of a structure that then is being created by this particular dynamic. But the point is that, of course, once people have an understanding of what they think the facts are, that's at the point at which they decide what it is they want to do. And that depends on their values. What else could it depend on? But if you don't know what's going on, there can never be any reliable connection between the kinds of choices you make about how to act and what your values are.
Yeah, I was thinking, so have you compared with other societies? Because you conducted your studies pretty much in the U.S. or other countries?
Well, come to Florida now to do it too. Texas I went to once. No, we did. Yeah.
Does it mean that our children, not American, but like children in America or American American people are not being taught how to think critically,
Well,
or how to reason, or how to solve.
yeah, except in fact they are, and the ones who think, well, gee, that's a plausible conjecture that we don't know enough science, and so more, you know. But if you actually see that the people who actually have the most scientific knowledge, who display the kinds of critical reasoning skills like numeracy and cognitive reflection that are most essential to actually understanding and using empirical information, are the most divided, well, then the problem isn't that we don't have enough of that. There's something that is making people who have those kinds of abilities not actually get the benefit of them, and stopping the rest of us from getting the benefit of that too. We should have a better science education system, right? But that's not going to fix this problem. This problem is going to stop us from getting the benefit of whatever that is. But it is not just the United States. I mean, we've adapted our measures to Australia and UK. And well, that's easy. Yeah, we thought that would be easy. We tried Canada. It was very hard. But we might have a theory that these dispositions that I'm characterizing with the 2x2, they exist everywhere. I'm not sure. You could have that. It's not crazy, I don't think. What would be crazy, though, would be to think that they're going to express it the same way everywhere. You know, because we can't observe it, so we ask questions that we think will be correlated with it. But how a person might express that will be different in some other country. You just translate it into another language. You have to adapt it, right? Then at that point we would say, huh, once I have measures of these dispositions, how does it, you know, are the patterns the same? I think that's just inconceivable. I mean, I know that in Europe they have this kind of problem with genetically modified foods. I'd like to know why we don't, because if you only study problems where you do have the problems and don't look at the cases where you don't, you can't actually draw any valid inferences about how these things happen, right? But it does happen there, and it's the same dynamic. And we were able to show with our measures, gee, Australians in the UK, they have the same. Australia's more American than America, I discovered with these measures, right? Really individualistic and very big patterns like this. But, you know, in the UK especially, nothing like this on guns. You know, they actually do have a general vaccine crisis with people divided there. You know, here we had that with the HPV, but, and, you know, you should be very concerned about any pockets of insufficient vaccination. But in fact, you know, the 90% you saw with the HPV, that's true for all the childhood vaccinations. And these groups aren't divided on that. So, yeah, it happens. And the fact that it happens and generates patterns that are different is part of my confidence that there's nothing necessary about this, that these technologies aren't born with meanings. Even with reference to those kinds of dispositions, they acquire them through some kind of process. And that process never does anybody any good.
I'd like to ask a question, if you don't mind, about the study you did between the hand cream and the guns. And it seems like hand cream as an issue is non-political and guns are hyper-political.
Yeah.
Did you look at any sort of like tediously political issues?
What
Like a political issue that might be more tedious and maybe
Oh.
not as part, maybe
Yeah.
not as wrapped with identities?
Well, so what we wanted to do, well, see, what we wanted to do, too, of course, you know, that was deliberate. We had the idea that if we can show that there's a proficiency that depends on numeracy and that then is used opportunistically when people are assessing information that has this kind of significance for their identity, it would help to corroborate the hypothesis that that's why you see. So we do that deliberately. Now, but here you could take an issue. I mean, I do think it's the case that it's consistent with this idea that people, when issues become connected to these meanings, will predictably use, you know, their reasoning power to perfect the connection between their beliefs and their commitments to their groups, that the people who have that disposition, they might more reliably identify some of the issues that are like that. And somebody else might make a mistake on that because they don't have as good an ability to process the information. I mean, we did this study with the nanotechnology, right? And we found, you know, 80% of people say they don't know anything about nanotechnology. The 20%, they say know a little. That's how you know they know something. But the 90% will have an opinion one way or the other. But it's all noise because they haven't heard about it, right? So you give them a little bit of information, and immediately, you know, balanced information, just like in the HPV, they're polarizing. It's not their priors. They didn't have any. But they saw something in there, you know, that the resonances that connected that to the issues that already have this kind of property that marks their membership in a group. You know, they're pretty good at that. But it would have been really interesting to have a science comprehension or numeracy measure to see if, in fact, and I would expect that that's more likely in the people who have a greater degree of science comprehension, right? Maybe one study was a little bit like this. I did a study. Had people take this test, you know, the critical reasoning test, the cognitive reflection test. And then I said, okay, you just did a test. And psychologists have some evidence, here it is, that this is a measure of how open-minded people are. Oh, by the way, you know, somebody did a study that found that people who believe in climate change don't score as high. Or, by the way, people who are skeptical about climate change, they don't score as high. And it turned out then that I'd ask them, do you think this is a valid test, given everything you know about it? And the answer would depend very heavily on whether they had been told that people who have the position that is consistent with the one in their group on climate change scored higher or lower. But among people who scored higher on the open-minded test, they did it more, right? So it's just kind of obnoxious. But you see, actually, I described it to you. And it's kind of even hard to listen to follow exactly. You keep following it. But you have to think about it and see. It's easy to miss what the significance is. It's not a boring issue, but it's kind of, you know, it's buried in there. It's not what you want. You want something that doesn't have quite as much, you know, as you have to be smart enough to know that this will divide us. Yeah, we should do a study like that. Yeah, any issues we can do? Well, let's talk later.
So much of the information that we seek on the internet, how do the ways internet searches are conducted either exacerbate or alleviate the problem of real truth and then the contextual truth I'm happy to accept? It seems like to me it would be a significant obstacle to getting us out of the context of just
well,
we and our friends.
Except, you know, I guess that's possible. I mean, that's certainly plausible, and we've been worried for decades, you know, about the echo chamber effect about the internet and so forth. And kind of the proof that there is one is that that claim keeps echoing, even though when you investigate, I mean, here's what you find out. People who aren't, you know, at the same moment that, you know, there's that group watching MSNBC and that one, you know, watching Rachel Maddow, and they're watching O'Reilly, 10 times as many people are watching America's Funniest Pet Videos. And they don't care about that, and they don't want to hear about it. And if you give them an option of what to watch, they're always going to turn the channel from that. If you put people who are partisans in the room, they'll turn in, because they want to see what they want to see. Now you give them a TV set where they can either watch America's Funniest Pet Videos or only MSNBC. Even the guy who normally watches Fox is going to watch MSNBC, because the thing he likes to do second most after agreeing with O'Reilly is disagreeing with Maddow, you see. And when you expose him to her position, they only get stronger too. And so there are some people like this. I'm not sure that the medium sort of is exacerbating it or creating it. There actually aren't that many people like that. You know, obviously the people who aren't like that, they might be divided too. It's traveling from these other people. But the evidence, you know, there's obviously a kind of reciprocal relation between the stake people have in the issue and their exploitation of this medium. Right? It's hard to pin it on the medium.
If I could follow up just one little bit, I guess my concern is less with those media outlets, but more if I've been to many of those media outlets and I search climate change. What is the likelihood that Google is going to show me something it thinks I want to see?
Well, actually, too, that's a good point. If you go to Amazon.com, you know, go to Amazon, you don't have to have, like, what's his name, Watson, that really smart. Even Watson's kind of stupid cousin computer can be the intelligence algorithm at Amazon. You just see, you know, if the guy bought the book that's called More Guns, Less Crime, he also bought these 15 other books that say the same thing. If he bought the one that says More Guns, We're All Going to Die, he buys the 15 that say the other. And it's either people are trying really hard to expose themselves to information that's contrary to their views so they can figure out whether they're right, or they're just arming themselves. Right? Now, But you see, most people on Amazon.com type in everything I needed to know I learned in kindergarten, and then they get another thing about, well, actually in first grade and second grade you learn a little bit too, and so they're not, it is out there, but I think it's only giving them exactly what they want. And I think the problem isn't so much the partisanship, it's the kind of condition that's creating, certainly once you're in that situation though, I mean, there's so much information that people can lay their hands on to reinforce the views. That's got to make things worse. But it's not. They're not doing it on the skin cream. They're not doing it on so many issues. And on so many issues, too, where presumably they're actually getting a benefit from having access to so much information. Right? So I just can't believe information is the problem. I refuse to believe it. It's against my worldview.
So what they did was they primed a conservative influencer for Gary to win over the conservative opposition. How else would you have gone about doing that that would not have?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think it's not a good idea to try to manipulate people. I mean, maybe this is just, motivated reasoning. I think it's not likely to work. And science communication is not propagandizing. There might actually be some things that both sciences know about, right? But it's not to try to engineer a state of opinion. It's to try to create the conditions in which people will use their reasoning abilities in the way that will best advance their welfare. And my view is that by the time that was happening with Perry, I mean, we'll try to do something, but why did it ever get to that point, you see? Because the kinds of things, we started collecting this data, saw this happening in 2007, before it was even approved to design the study, try to predict what's going to happen. You do it with nanotechnology, do it with synthetic biology. You can forecast these things, and there was no reason that the HPV vaccine had to make its way into Texas, understood as the 11-year-old, 12-year-old girl, you can't come to school otherwise STD shot, because it could have been boys, girls, the thing that your pediatrician tells you. They listen to their doctor unless they're in this environment that causes their reason to misfire in the way that you see in the numeracy experiment, where, I mean, I think it would horrify them. This is fine. You're at a baseball. The initial study like this called "They Saw a Game," right, where they took the subjects in the study. They showed them from two Ivy League colleges. Watch the film of the football game between your school and your rival because the referee made some controversial calls. And of course, all the Dartmouth students said, he's screwing Dartmouth, he should be fired, and all the Penn students said, he shouldn't have called a penalty on our kicker at that point, because they had this stake in connecting with the group that affected what they were seeing. And it's exactly this, although this isn't polarization between Dartmouth and Penn, what's the relevant group? Now, if you told them that, they weren't doing it on purpose, they probably wouldn't be surprised. And they probably actually, on reflection, would go, hey, it's okay, actually. I don't want to go to the Yale Bowl, the stadium, and say, no, everybody, our guy was out of bounds. We lose this time. Well, maybe next year. Your life as a fan won't go so well. Because, so sometimes you actually have a stake in the kind of collaboration between your modes of perception and reason and these kinds of ties. But now, if that's what I tell the person who was trying to decide whether to have a shot for his or her daughter about the HPV, you were thinking about that, the same way a Red Sox and Yankee fan would about whether Bucky Dent's 1978 home run was, and the one-game playoff was fair or foul. I think they would be horrified, right? And they were not provided something they should have been, which was a process that tries to anticipate the kinds of conditions under which they'll become apprised of what's known by science in the way that will make it most likely that they'll see what is known, right? So I say you should have stopped that from happening. And you could have, easily. And you can see that it will happen again and again and again because it's built in. It's Popper's revenge. But we have the means for doing it. Now, once it happens, then you got to have decontamination. But we're really out of time, aren't we? Darn it. You even have papers on this, that try to, what can you do to dissolve the link people see between a position on this issue and their identity so that they don't have to make a choice between knowing what's known and being who they are. Why would we ever want to put people in that position?